What happens when even Martin Luther King Jr., as closest allies, doubt his vision? This is the untold story of how Dr. King faced resistance from within his own team, but stayed true to his dream of unity and justice. Follow his journey from the tense debates in Birmingham to the historic March on Washington, where his iconic words inspired millions and changed the course of history forever. Stay tuned for a story of resilience, courage, and the power of a dream to unite a nation. The year was 1963, and the civil rights movement was at a crossroads. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sat in a dimly lit church basement in Birmingham, Alabama, surrounded by members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. The room was filled with tension as his team debated the next steps. The movement had faced setbacks, and cracks were beginning to show. Some members doubted whether nonviolence was the right approach. Others questioned whether Dr. King's dream of a united nation could ever be realized. Among the dissenters was James Porter, a fiery young activist who believed direct action was the only way forward. "Dr. King," James began, his voice steady but sharp, "we've marched, we've protested, and yet segregation still stands strong. People are losing faith in this movement. Maybe it's time to consider more drastic measures." King leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I understand your frustration, James," he said calmly, "but violence will only breed more violence. Our goal is not just to change laws, but to change hearts." The room erupted in debate, with voices overlapping and tensions running high. King remained silent, his expression thoughtful but firm. Later that evening, King returned to his modest motel room. As he sat at his desk, the weight of the movement bore down on him. He opened his notebook and began to write, searching for words that could reignite the faith of his team and the nation. "I have to remind them why we're doing this," he murmured to himself. "They need to see the vision again." The next day, King called for a private meeting with his closest advisors. "We will march in Birmingham," he declared, his voice filled with conviction. "But this time, we must show the world the power of nonviolence and unity." As the team prepared for the march, tensions remained high. James approached King after the meeting, his skepticism still evident. "Dr. King, I hope you're right about this," he said. King placed a hand on James' shoulder. "Have faith, James. Together, we will show the world what's possible." But as the day of the march approached, doubts lingered in the minds of his team. Would this bold move be enough to unite a divided nation? The day of the march arrived with a crisp morning breeze. Dr. King stood at the front of the line, wearing his signature dark suit, his determined gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind him stretched a crowd of activists, students, clergy, and everyday citizens united by a shared hope for justice. James Porter walked a few paces behind King, his skepticism still visible in his furrowed brow. "This better work," he muttered to a fellow marcher. As the march began, the group moved through the streets of Birmingham with quiet determination. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the brick walls of the city, interspersed with the chants of "We shall overcome." As the marchers approached Kelly Ingram Park, they were met with a chilling sight. Rows of police officers standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking their path. Some held batons, others leashed snarling dogs. Fire trucks stood ready, hoses coiled like snakes, a clear message of intimidation. The march slowed as tension rippled through the crowd. James, his fist clenched, leaned toward King. "Dr. King, this is what we're up against. Are you still sure about nonviolence?" King turned to him, his voice steady but firm. "Yes, James. Our strength lies in our ability to stand without fear, to show the world the injustice we face without stooping to their level." The police ordered the marchers to disperse. When they refused, the fire hoses roared to life, spraying high-pressure water at the crowd. People stumbled, children screamed, and the air was filled with chaos. But instead of retaliating, the marchers held their ground. King stood tall, his soaked suit clinging to him as he helped an elderly woman back to her feet. James watched in awe as people around him followed King's lead, linking arms and singing through the onslaught. For the first time, James saw the power of nonviolence not as weakness, but as an unshakable strength. As the police escalated their tactics, news crews captured the brutality. Within hours, images of peaceful marchers being attacked flooded newspapers and television screens across the nation. People from all walks of life were horrified by what they saw. In cities far and wide, sympathy marches began to spring up. Churches held vigils, and letters of support poured into Birmingham from around the world. James approached King that evening, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Dr. King, I've never seen anything like this. You were right. This is how we make them see." King smiled, his exhaustion evident, but his spirit unwavering. "This is only the beginning, James. The world is watching, and now we must give them something to believe in." As the team regrouped that night, King received word that city officials planned to arrest him and other leaders the next day. "Let them," he said, his voice calm. "If that's the price of justice, I will gladly pay it." James stared at King, both inspired and worried. "What happens if they lock you up?" King looked him in the eye. "Then we show them that even behind bars, the dream lives on." As dawn broke the next day, Birmingham police arrested Dr. King and several other leaders. The news quickly spread, sparking outrage and worry among the marchers. James Porter stood in the park, watching as King was taken away. "What do we do now?" a young protester asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated, but then he heard King's voice in his mind. "Even behind bars, the dream lives on." He straightened up. "We keep marching," he said firmly. Dr. King sat in a dim, cramped cell with nothing but a cot, a small desk, and a barred window. Despite the grim conditions, his spirit remained unbroken. Armed with only scraps of paper and a borrowed pencil, King began to write what would later become one of the most powerful documents of the civil rights movement. The letter from Birmingham jail. His words flowed with conviction. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He addressed critics who had called his actions untimely and unwise, passionately defending the urgency of the movement. "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed," he wrote. James and the other leaders outside the jail worked tirelessly to ensure King's message reached the world. Smuggled out piece by piece, the letter was typed up and distributed to churches, newspapers, and activists across the country. When James read the letter in its entirety, he was moved to tears. "This isn't just a letter," he said to the team. "This is a call to action for everyone who believes in justice." As King's letter spread, its impact was immediate. Clergy members who had previously criticized the movement publicly apologized. Politicians were forced to acknowledge the depth of injustice in Birmingham. Ordinary citizens, inspired by King's words, joined the cause in record numbers. Protests erupted in cities nationwide, with people carrying signs that read, "We stand with Birmingham and justice cannot wait." James found himself taking on a leadership role, in King's absence, guiding marches and organizing community meetings. For the first time, he fully understood what King had meant when he said, "Our strength lies in our unity." After 8 days in jail, King was released to a hero's welcome. As he stepped out into the sunlight, he was greeted by a cheering crowd and a visibly transformed James. "We've got more people marching than ever before," James said, his voice filled with hope. "Your letter lit a fire, Dr. King." King nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good. But the fight isn't over yet." With Dr. King's release from jail, the civil rights movement gained even greater momentum. His letter from Birmingham jail had not only reignited hope, but also rallied new supporters from across the nation. Still, Dr. King knew they needed to make an even bigger statement, a moment that would unite the country and demand action. Sitting in a small meeting room in Atlanta, King addressed his team. "It's time for the nation to hear us loud and clear. We will march on Washington, Organizing the March on Washington was no small feat. The team worked tirelessly to coordinate transportation, permits, speakers, and logistics for what they hoped would be the largest gathering in U.S. history. Leaders like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph joined forces to ensure the march would be a success. James Porter, now fully committed to King's vision, was tasked with mobilizing young activists. He traveled to colleges and high schools, sharing King's letter and urging students to join the march. "This isn't just a march," he told them. "This is history in the making." As the date approached, opposition to the march grew. Critics warned that it would lead to violence, and even some allies questioned the wisdom of bringing so many people together. During a late-night meeting, one team member voices concerns. "What if things go wrong? What if this backfires?" King, ever calm and resolute, responded, "What if it doesn't? What if this march becomes a moment the nation can no longer ignore our cause?" On August 28, 1963, the sun rose over Washington, D.C., casting a golden glow on the Lincoln Memorial. Buses, trains, and cars brought over 250,000 people to the National Mall. Families, students, workers, and clergy of all races stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their call for justice. James stood near the reflecting pool, overwhelmed by the sheer size and diversity of the crowd. "Dr. King," he said, turning to his mentor, "look at what you've done." King placed a hand on James' shoulder. "Look at what we've done. This is the power of unity." As the speakers took the stage, the anticipation grew. Finally, it was Dr. King's turn to speak. He walked to the podium, clutching his notes, and gazed out at the sea of hopeful faces. "This is it," James whispered to himself. "This is the moment." King adjusted the microphone and began to speak. Dr. King stood at the podium, the majestic Lincoln Memorial behind him, and a sea of over 250,000 people before him. The air buzzed with anticipation as he began to speak, his voice steady yet powerful. "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation." His words resonated deeply, weaving together the struggles of the past, the challenges of the present, and the hopes for a brighter future. As King neared the end of his prepared speech, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, standing nearby, called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Inspired by her encouragement, King set aside his notes and began to speak from the heart. "I have a dream." The crowd fell silent, captivated by his vision of a world where people would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His words painted a picture of unity and justice, of children of all races holding hands, of valleys lifted and hills made low. Standing in the crowd, James Porter felt tears streaming down his face. For the first time, he fully understood the depth of King's vision. It wasn't just about laws or protests. It was about transforming the soul of a nation. He glanced around and saw the impact of King's words on the diverse crowd. Families held hands, strangers embraced, and people of all ages listened with hope in their eyes. "This is it," James whispered. "This is what unity looks like." As King concluded with the powerful declaration, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted into applause, cheers, and tears. The moment was electric, reverberating far beyond the National Mall. News of the speech spread rapidly, appearing on front pages, television broadcasts, and radio stations around the world. King's "I Have a Dream" speech became a symbol of hope and a rallying cry for justice. In the days following the march, the civil rights movement gained unprecedented momentum. Laws began to change, and minds began to open. For James Porter, the experience transformed him into a lifelong advocate for nonviolence and justice. Dr. King, ever humble, reflected on the day with his team. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The dream will only live if we keep working for it." Years later, James stood on those same steps of the Lincoln Memorial, now an elder statesman of the movement. As he looked out over a group of young activists, he smiled. "Dr. King gave us a dream," he said, And now it's our job to keep it alive. Asterisk Martin Luther King Jr. S words changed the course of history, proving that one voice can unite a nation. From doubt within his own team to inspiring the largest civil rights march of its time, his dream continues to guide us. What do you think of Dr. King's legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll try to reply to as many as I can. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. See you in the next video. Asterisk.